Evening. It's great to see such an amazing crowd here. I'm Margaret O'Callaghan. I'm Acting Director of the Institute of Irish Studies here at Queen's. As you know, one of the flagships of our programme, our MA programme in Irish Studies, is a study of the city of Belfast. And the greatest contribution perhaps to that history recently made has been made by Sean Connolly and by Dom. So it's great that their newest publication is being launched here today. I'm going to now introduce Professor Peter Gray, the normal director or usual director, absent director of the Institute of Irish Studies, to give an introduction to our speakers today. So it's fantastic that so many of you are here. We're really pleased. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks very much, Margaret. A bit like Schrodinger's cat, I'm both absent and present at the same time. It's great to see so many people in this room, although we're probably breaking numerous Queen's health and safety regulations by having so many of you in. Just a little bit about the format of this afternoon. I'm going to say just a few brief words to introduce this wonderful book that we're launching today. Then great pleasure to introduce Bryan who's the political officer at the American Consulate, who's going to speak very briefly about issues of civic identity and public space in the modern world. And then we're going to hear from both our authors, or two of our three authors, I should say, of the book, Dominic, Bryan and Sean Connolly. And then, if you survive all of that, we have some wine at the back of the room, so we will kind of rearrange ourselves spatially, civically as well, to allow everyone access to the wine. We can spill down the stairs and up and down a bit as well at that point. So, but without further ado, welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure for me as the suspended temporarily Director of Irish Studies to introduce a book, Civic Identity and Public Space, Belfast since 1780, which is a book which is, I think, very central to the core ideas and the core principles of the Institute of Irish Studies, where we are here today. In 1965, Professor Emerson Evans, when he established the Institute of Irish Studies here at Queen's, did so with the purpose of creating an interdisciplinary environment in which researchers from different subject areas could find common ground to explore themes of relating to the environment, identity or identities, and cultures relating to the island of Ireland. And while Eston Evans' own principal focus was very much on the Irish countryside and its folkways, the city of Belfast has been a central area of research within the Institute for a long time. And indeed, as far back as 1987, we saw the publication of Province, City and People, Belfast and its Region, co-edited by the then Director and Assistant Director of the Institute, Ronnie Buchanan and Brian Walker. In more recent years, as Margaret has said, a rejuvenation of serious historical study of Belfast's past has been led by scholars associated with the Institute, including Sean Connolly, who's with us obviously tonight, with his landmark edited history of Belfast, Belfast 400, People, Place and History, which came out in 2012 with Liverpool University Press, and Owen Purdue's edited volume, Belfast, the Emerging City, 1850 to 1914, which came out in 2013. Both of those books drawing on a much wider field of research into Belfast history and society, carried out by scholars here in Queen's and in other institutions, and also by our PhD students and early career researchers. So the volume I have the tremendous pleasure to launch this afternoon has origin, I think, in the Institute of Irish Studies. Competitive research, grant writing may be the bane of academic life, but just occasionally it can also facilitate productive collaboration and publications of landmark importance. And the research for this book was supported by an ESRC Research Award for a project entitled Imagining Belfast Political Rituals, Symbols and Crowds, which is jointly held by Sean and Dom, who was then the director of the Institute, and which brought together into the project a number of researchers, including John Nagle, who has a chapter in the current volume, who's now a lecturer in politics. He has an anthropology degree, but he's a lecturer in sociology politics in Aberdeen.
In Aberdeen, yeah.
And also Gillian McIntosh as well, who's long associated with the research of the Institute. So this, our studies hosted the project, which is a collaboration of historians and anthropologists into the formation and public expression of identity in Belfast by means of a long-term historical study combined with an anthropological investigation of recent developments. The project has already given rise to a number of publications, but it is the laying of the capstone to the project that we're marking today with the publication of this monograph on civic identity and public space in Belfast. So we have a number of speakers today, including the authors who will explain the developments and problems of managing urban public space and its importance to communal identities. So I will restrict myself just to a brief overview of the book, just to let you know what it's about before passing on to people who are much more expert in the field. The purposes of this book are twofold. First of all, to historicise the concept of public space and to trace how this has been constructed in changing ways over time since the late 18th century, especially as this applies to the urban case study of Belfast. The argument made is that Belfast's deviance in significant part, but not in whole, from the norms of the development of civic identity in the modern industrial city, make it particularly worthy of historical study in its own right. But secondly, the authors believe that such a historical perspective can also offer a concrete contribution to contemporary understandings and a possible resolution of current contests over the display of flags, parades and other divisive symbols of identity in the public space of Belfast. Historically, the idea of urban public space developed in the 19th century as part of the transition of control over the town, later the city, from a landed proprietorial elite, the Donegal family in the case of Belfast, to bourgeois liberal ratepayers, accompanied by large-scale urban improvement, the creation of civic infrastructure, and the suburbanisation of middle-class residents. As with all modernising towns, the democratisation of urban space was accompanied by the imposition of regulations on behaviour and activity and attempts to create a cross-class civic identity for the town. Thus, restrictions and prohibitions on the use of public space have always formed part of the modern urban experience, albeit contested and confronted at certain times and places. What makes Belfast distinct, at least in the British context, the authors argue, is the extent to which these liberal structures were undermined by the growing extent of rival ethno-national forms of communal identity, either rejecting or seeking to suborn the civic identity promoted by the urban elites, and asserting a right to manifest their identity through parades and the display of symbols in the public space that the older elites had sought to preserve for civic symbolism. Following the repeal of the Party Processions Act in the early 1870s in particular, Protestant and Loyalist organisations sought successfully to attain privileged access to the symbolically important civic space of the city centre, although they were unsuccessful in seeking to impose a parading monopoly and the full exclusion of Catholic nationalist bodies from access to high status sites such as the Ulster Hall. Only in the wake of partition and the establishment of Belfast as the capital of the northern state did a more widespread bar on the use of such space for nationalist and to a lesser extent Catholic manifestations of identity in the city become more complete, although this was much more lightly placed in Catholic districts of the city. The final chapters of this book look at how the public space in Belfast has been transformed in more recent decades. John Nagle's chapter on the 1960s considers how officially non-aligned movements such as the Northern Ireland branch of CND, tenants associations and the revival of May Day parading by the left partially impinged on the unionist hegemony over public space in the city and paved the way for the more confrontational civil rights movements and people's democracy marches that followed. Dominic Bryan, in his final concluding chapters, discusses how public space has been renegotiated in Belfast in the context of the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement and associated legislation from the 1990s. This has involved both an attempt to reshape the city's civic culture away from its emphasis on Britishness and commerce and towards the carnivalesque and the diverse, the imposition of greater controls over the forms and routes of some loyalist demonstrations, and of course the controls over the official display of the Union flag, and some opening of the city centre to forms of nationalist demonstration. This transformation is far from uncontested and complete, as the agenda of parity of esteem has inevitably been regarded by many in the unionist communities as undermining their entitlements and rights. And the risk, as Dominic points out, is the rejection of the concept of shared space, entrenching a partitioned space of separate communities within the city. The conclusion of this book is that Belfast as a site of contested and reimagined public space has been in a process of long-term historical change that will continue for the foreseeable future. What this book offers is a way of understanding that change, and through that making a substantive contribution to debates that continue to dominate the public life of this city and the province that lies beyond it. So I have great pleasure in recommending to you Civic Identity in Public Space Belfast since 1780. We do have flyers here at the front, which will give you a substantial discount on the cover price. You're very welcome to come and examine the few copies that we have here at the front as well. But without further ado, I know because we're packed and overheated, and you no doubt want to hear from people who have thought more deeply and researched more thoroughly on the subject than I have. I'm going to pass over first to Bryan Walkley. Bryan, as I said, is the political officer of the US Consulate General here in Belfast. We're delighted to have him here with us. He's going to say a few words about the role of the Consulate General in Belfast. So, Bryan.
Or something like that. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. I'd like to thank Professor Bryan for the invitation and the privilege of participating in the launch today of the collaborative work on civic identity in public space, Belfast since 1780. This isn't my usual gig, so I very much appreciate the opportunity to get out of the office and engage in something other than discussions of the B word, because that's my life these days. So if I'll just say a few words now, if I can, in support of this project. The United States has certainly faced its share of challenges when it comes to the management of civic space. We officially recognize and embrace free access to it for peaceful assembly, protest, and occasional celebration. On the spare occasion, we may even use it for a parade. But experience has taught us that civic space cannot be taken for granted. Over the years, and that means decades and centuries in the United States, we've seen it expand in some cases, only later to regress as more restrictive laws were enacted that purposely or not would silence some of the independent voices that were participating. We've witnessed its narrow as an unintended consequence of well-meaning policies, such as the enforcement of security precautions, and more specifically, anti-terrorism regulations. We've also seen it exploited by those who would arguably abuse the freedoms that it guarantees to spread messages of hate and bigotry, promoting discrimination and segregation, and in some cases with the ultimate intention of curtailing these very freedoms for some, and in the hopes of achieving, dare I say, sectarian ends. The United States government, including the US Department of State, who I represent, who I'm speaking on behalf of here today, understands the value and vulnerabilities of civic space and civil society, and where possible have sought to strengthen and protect them globally. We've done so at home and abroad by engaging in advocacy and outreach to help strengthen the policy environment for civil society, as well as strengthen the institutions that depend on the availability of civic space for engagement. As a society, the United States also broadly supports research, policy analysis, and innovative practices to help advance civil society development. Believing that societies are stronger and more resilient when everyone has a chance to express themselves, but even more so when people are given the opportunity to access open civic spaces, protected open civic spaces that allow and encourage people to actively participate in initiatives intended to improve and strengthen their communities and societies. On behalf of the US government and US Consulate in Belfast, Northern Ireland, I would like to officially recognize and congratulate you on the work being done here at Queen's University, and today specifically the publication of the work by Professors Bryan and Connolly, knowing that there are lessons to be found here in Belfast that will no doubt be of benefit to the collective understanding and advancement of civil society and broader protection of civic space here and far beyond for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. We're now going to pass over to Sean Connolly, Emeritus Professor of Irish History here at Queen's, an authority on many aspects of Irish history from the early modern period through to the recent past, author of numerous books on Catholic Ireland, on the Protestant elites in 18th century Ireland, on, as we've already heard, the editor of Belfast 400, an author of numerous articles and chapters relating to the more recent history of Belfast as well as to these older histories which I've spoken about. Sean, you're going to talk to us about the history of civic space in 19th century Belfast.
Briefly, yes. Yeah, briefly, because the room is very crowded. Okay, well, as Peter's already said, this book is a collaboration between an historian and an anthropologist. It begins with the large-scale replanning of the town of Belfast that took place in the late 18th century under the direction of the, for all practical purposes, the owner of the town, the Earl and later Marquess of Donegal. It finishes with a review of the most recent attempts by Belfast City Council to formulate policies for identity, for equality and the fostering of civic culture. It's a collaboration for which I've certainly learned a great deal. But it came about in a very casual way, over a completely unstructured conversation over coffee, where Dominic, Bryan and I discovered that from our very different starting points, we nevertheless had very similar ideas about what was missing from most of the existing literature on Belfast, whether by historians or social scientists. And I take two lessons out of that. One is that nothing is as effective in persuading academics to climb out of their disciplinary silos and collaborate across subject boundaries as a shared conviction that they're right and everybody else is wrong. Secondly, that the best ideas do not necessarily come from high-powered managerial initiatives or from elaborate working parties and committees. And sometimes, and I'm saying this in a university which some years ago closed down its staff common room and shows no interest in reopening it, sometimes all you need is to create spaces and opportunities for academic staff to get together and to talk to each other, not about research strategies and funding opportunities, but simply about ideas. So, what exactly did the two of us come up with out of this departure from managerially sanctioned norms about how research should be carried out? What struck us both in our different ways was the extent to which most of what was being written about Belfast is really focused on the specifics of the local situation, and how little attempt there was to think in broader terms about the city. To think about the city as a particular type of community, and also to think about the city as a particular type of physical space. Now, in my case, this meant, in particular, an appreciation of the unique character of the Victorian city. The 19th century in Britain is a golden age of urban civilization. It sees provincial towns triumph over horrendous environmental problems to create safe, orderly environments. And also, at the same time, to become active centres of cultural achievement and of the cultivation of civic pride. You only have to walk down into the centre of Belfast and look at the buildings surrounding Donegal Square or Royal Avenue to see that it is very much a product of that same era. So clearly it makes sense to look at Belfast in that context as a place that, as Peter said earlier, in some ways participates fully in that great flourishing of urban culture and civilization, and in some ways falls tragically short of doing so. Okay, more specifically, we were interested in space. Now, disputes, there's no secret, disputes about public space. Who is permitted to gather or walk in streets and squares and parks? Who is allowed to display their symbols and emblems of identity? Disputes of this kind have been part of the public life of Belfast for most of the last 2 centuries. And therefore it's understandable that people tend to see these disputes as having a timeless character. They've always been with us, and there's not much you can say other than that they're there. And in addition, some contemporary participants in these disputes today are fond of dressing up their claims in deliberately archaic language. For example, talking about the right to walk the Queen's Highway, to get across the message that they're only appealing to common law rights to go back at least to the age of Alfred the Great. Now, of course, the truth is that, as Peter has already said, public space, as we know it today, is very much a creation of the same 19th century in which Belfast rose to prominence. It's during that great era of urban improvement in the 19th century that narrow streets and alleyways, which nobody in the right mind would want to process through, are cleared away to make way for broad, straight streets, giving way regularly to larger squares, that public parks are laid out to give urban dwellers access to green spaces and fresh air, and that whole new type of public civic building emerges. Places like the Ulster Hall and the Belfast Central Library, which are large sort of temples to civic culture open to a general public. So all of these are public spaces, but they're also regulated spaces. If you were to walk into Belfast's first public park, Olmo Park, created in 1871 out of what had been the domain of the Marquess of Donegal, the first thing you would see would be a great big sign telling you what you were not allowed to do. Lie on the grass, play football, sing songs, play music, consume alcohol, and so on and so forth. Because it stands to reason. If public space is going to be open to everybody, then you have to have mechanisms to ensure that one person's use of that public space does not impinge on another's. So the streets and squares, the newly laid out streets and squares of the remodeled town centre are patrolled by an equally new urban police force, a large part of whose job is to impose discipline on the behaviour of the people walking through those streets and squares. For the first time, it becomes an offence to be visibly drunk in public, even if you're not doing anything else that's wrong. Children start being taken up for playing ball in the streets or for making slides in winter. Men start being prosecuted for congregating in street corners to play games of pitch and toss and so on. And processions, demonstrations of public meetings, whether they're by political parties or religious groups or trade unions or whoever, now require negotiation with the authorities to ensure that they can be permitted. So in other words, there was never a golden age in which public space was open unconditionally to all. It was always subject to regulation. Regulation and the opening of space to the public are two sides of the same coin. And it would be a small but useful contribution to progress if everybody engaged in debates on these topics today could start from that simple realization. The second major point that emerges from the historical part of the study is that the sort of liberal order I've been talking about, where public space is open to all as long as they meet a certain threshold of respectability and abide by certain rules. That liberal order actually worked much better than in Belfast than is normally recognised. It's repeatedly claimed that after the great riots of the Home Rule era, 1885-1886, Belfast city centre was closed to Catholics and nationalists. That is just, and a Protestant group like the Orange Order had a monopoly of public space. That is simply not true. It is the case that Catholic and nationalist events in Victorian and Edwardian Belfast had faced more obstacles. They had to work a bit harder to show that they were reputable to be allowed onto the streets. But they were allowed onto the streets, they were not excluded. Just to take one example, in 1906, John Dillon, one of the main leaders of the Irish Nationalist Party of Westminster, arrives in Belfast and processes in an open carriage, surrounded by his supporters, down the Falls Road, through Castle Street, and through Donegal Place to his hotel on Donegal Square. And the Ulster Hall, from the time it passes from private ownership into the control of the City Council, is repeatedly used by groups like the United Irish League, at meetings addressed by people like Dillon, the nationalist leader John Redmond, the local nationalist MP Joe Devlin, and so on. It is true that the Arthur True of the Belfast Protestant Association announced in 1900 that he would not allow further Catholic and nationalist events in the town centre, but it was Arthur True who ended up in jail for his part in the disgraceful attacks on a Catholic Corpus Christi procession on the Antrim Road in 1901. It was only after 1920, when Belfast became the capital of a separate political unit, Northern Ireland, that the law on public space became blatantly one-sided, with Orange and Protestant events allowed unfettered access, while nationalist, and we need to remember also socialist events, were excluded. Even then, the position was rather less clear-cut than is sometimes assumed. For example, in 1934, armed police were deployed to protect people attending a giant conference organised by the Catholic Truth Society in Belfast, attended by 80 to 100,000 people. And a Presbyterian minister and a female admirer were both prosecuted for the inflammatory remarks they made during a Protestant counter-demonstration. And in fact, even later, the O'Neill government's decision in 1966 to allow what were at times really quite militaristic commemorations of the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising to take place without interference in Belfast, could arguably be placed up there somewhere alongside the siting of the new University of Ulster as steps on the road to the violence that erupted in 1869. So, as I say, things are not quite as clear-cut as is sometimes assumed. But at this stage, however, we're entering the point where history shades into journalism, which is an appropriate moment to pass over to my colleague, Professor Bryan.
Thanks, Sean, and I'm going to equally try and be brief, but come up with some interesting topics that in this area that has inspired us to think about the nature of civic space. I firstly want to say a particular thank you to Sean, who was incredibly patient and tolerant, given that I think it took me nearly 4.5–5 years to finish my bits of this book, and Sean badgered me, made me feel guilty as he was justified to do, but very patiently waited till we brought this to some conclusion, and I'm grateful for his patience through that period. As Sean said, we developed this project out of the interest of trying to say something different about the relationships in this city, about recognising that in some ways this city was like many other cities and shouldn't be just depicted in a simple story of orange and green, but also that the relationship between that orange and green is a much more complicated one. In the modern era, we depict it perhaps too easily by showing pictures of walls in the city, and in doing so we oversimplify the relationships that take place within the city, and in doing that we can make some really severe mistakes on how we are moving forward and can move forward in the future, because the way we understand those public and civic spaces varies over time and changes. Just to pick up on something Bryan said, right up until the 1890s, the idea of parades and processions in Washington, D.C. was seen as a threat to democracy. They actually didn't allow people to use public spaces in the capital city in D.C. precisely because they felt it would threaten the democratic space. That just goes to show the understanding of what you should and shouldn't do in the public space changes over time. What seemed obvious to Sean and I is that you had to take that space seriously, all right? When understanding this city's evolution and development, you had to ask yourself what was being navigated through that space. And in the contemporary period, right the way through that's not just about looking at who has power and who allows who in, but there's a whole social class ratcheting taking place of what is seen as decent and right in the civic space and what is excluded. So you could take an event like the 12th of July, which we often see as dominating the public space and would get talked about very often when you talk about parades in Belfast, and actually you find a complex relationship between the groups of people that take part in the 12th of July and the civic space. Often an uncomfortable relationship between the police and the civic authorities with that parade taking place, because the parade is also carnivalesque and drunkard. All right, it is both respectful, all right, and loyal and carnivalesque and drunkard all at the same time. All right, so civic authorities have never found it an easy place, an easy event to deal with, even when unionist regimes might have been hegemonic and dominate. I think the most, and I mentioned this in the book, I think perhaps the most startling thing to think about in that, if you think of 12th of July as perhaps being the most obvious outworking of popular loyalty to the throne on these islands, it is interesting that the monarch or her family or any of her entourage have not been anywhere near it in 200 years. All right, there's a tension there that one needs to look at, which says that it's an outworking of loyalty that those that they're being loyal to would steer clear of. That, I mention that only to say that tells you how complicated that civic space is. All right, that civic space is dominated by ideas of respectability, of law and justice, of policing, of commercial interest, of ideas of democracy, freedom of speech, and recently, conceptually, by ideas of shared space, which is the chapters which I've written and I have become interested in, and how you manage that shared space and how you manage that shared space in a peace process, in a way that I would suggest has been done relatively successfully by Belfast City Council. It's often pointed out that Belfast residentially is more divided now than it ever has been in its history. I would probably want to put forward an argument that the city space is more shared than it ever has been in its history. Therefore, we have a conundrum. Belfast is both more divided and more shared at the same time. All right? And if we're discussing how the city progresses, we have to deal with both of those things at one and the same time. And we've seen the growth and development of civic events. We've seen a massive change of those events. Sean mentioned something that interested me, and the idea of a development of the carnival. Some of you have noticed that almost anything now gets the word carnival attached to it. All right. When I wrote a couple of things which suggested that 12th of July was carnivalesque, I needless to say upsetted a number of anthropologists who deal with carnival, who looked at the 12th of July and just couldn't see carnival in it. Well, I've argued that you're not looking close enough at how people behave and what they get out of it if you're not seeing it to a degree of being carnivalesque. But also it's interesting that things like St Patrick's Day also gets described as the carnival, and the Belfast, the Lord Mayor's show has been described as the Belfast Carnival as well. So what is it in the description of the civic, all right, of which carnival has some perhaps meaning simply that it's diverse and we're all welcome to it, becomes so important. People have adapted their events, or attempted to adapt their events to pick up on the nature of the civic space, and that's St Patrick's Day, that's the 12th of July, that's a Pride event. I was even having discussions, and here's where we may go in the future, with a few people about Culture Night, which has become massively successful, and some of you might have been there on Friday. I notice it's also becoming quite drunken. All right, I don't know if people have picked up on that, but in the last few years, the sort of drinking that's going on, and the way that, and I predict that there'll be a pullback on that at some point, that things are going to start to happen. If you like, it's got even that event, alternative event, has become somewhat carnivalesque late on and a little bit out of control. All right, and I think you'll see the City Council and the police, before you know it, it's a bit like St Patrick's Day in New York and Boston, you'll have no drinking on the street. And for me, having watched the St Patrick's Day in New York, no drinking on the street is disastrous, given that you've got to stand there for 5 hours in usually a windy, cold New York, watching lots of uniformed men just march along the road. If you're not drinking, then it's a struggle, to be honest with you. So that the space that we have is important, and it's important to understand because it's an important part of a much more complicated, layered relationship between the peoples that visit in this, that live in this city, and I'm convinced that we have to be aware of that and a player in that game. All right, we have to be thinking about how we allow that space to exist, and finally, I suppose I'd just like to say how nice it's been to try and sit down and talk and research using both materials from anthropology and history. I've sort of straddled that, although I've been on one side for a long time. And it was nice for me when the schools of anthropology and history were thrown together, and I still think that we're prospering from it. Material out of this, such as is now flowing into looking at public history that Olwyn is doing, and I think the tensions that come out of that and the discussions are really productive. So I'm gonna finish up with that. I hope that if you do get a chance to read it, you'll find it interesting, but I particularly hope that it allows people to think about why we need to constantly engage with understanding the public space, with ideas of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and what we mean by shared public civic spaces. With that, I think, do you want to say anything more, Peter, or do we want to...
I think, I know it's tempting that there's wine just over there, but if anyone has any questions, any short questions they want to put to Dom or Sean or to Bryan, we could do that now, just for a few minutes. Do you have any questions they're desperate to ask of our authors?
Hi, so I actually just finished writing my dissertation. I used quite a lot of John Nagle's work in my dissertation, so I'm very excited.
And I should probably be remiss to thank John, who isn't here because he's over in Aberdeen, for his work. Yeah.
But my question is kind of like, you talked a lot about the use of sort of sectarian negotiation of the space. Does the book also discuss non-sectarian group use of space, as in like more minority communities, like the LGBT communities?
It does. In fact, it talks about pride in the latter two chapters, and I think it's precisely the opening up of that space in the more recent era, which I think is fascinating. It's precisely the layering of identity. I mean, I've always thought I've never been a believer that we create a shared space and suddenly Protestant and Catholic come and embrace each other as Protestant and Catholic. But the space that Pride has taken clearly allows young people to experience the city in a way that they wouldn't have done otherwise. And in terms of a sense of citizenship and belonging, I think that's important. I also, just as an interesting aside, having watched, I think, the first Pride event, and not quite everyone since, think you will wait to see that a point when other aspects of that Pride event become problematic. I'll be interested today that somebody says maybe pole dancing on the back of a lorry isn't the sort of thing we'll have in the city. So as it becomes more successful, and interestingly, the most commercial of the events, more sponsorship in it than any of the other events since the decline of the old style Lord Mayor's Show, which used to have load of sponsorship in it, but doesn't anymore. You'll see some of the sort of civic pressures being rebrought to bear, I suspect, on Pride in the years to come. Just as I don't know. Did you want anything to add to that? Sure.
No.
Okay. Any other questions? Anyone else want to ask? No? Well, we won't keep you from the alcohol any longer in that case, so long as you approach it in a kind of in a manner appropriate for a civic.
I think it would also be useful if we thanked Richard English for coming today, and also thanked Alistair Muskimmon, the head of HAT. Also, I'd like to say that somebody who will be giving perhaps our Irish Studies lecture in the coming period is here at the moment, and that is the distinguished American lawyer Bryan. Thank you so much for being here today.
And I'll just add to that, you know what academic books are like, so I think it's £80 is the cover price. Yeah, well.
But there's a 50%.
But there's a code here. If you take one of these, there's a code here which can get you a significant amount off that. So if you are interested, come and take one of these leaflets, or probably just take a note of the code on your phone or something like that. And if you are interested, you can get it a good deal cheaper.
It's a 40% discount, brings it down to £48, which compared to 80 is it's still exorbitant, but compared to 80 it's
worth every penny.
Still ain't cheap.
But before we break up, can I ask you to thank Dom and Sean and Bryan for coming and speaking this afternoon. And then once we've done that, there's a lot of people in the room, so if you could find ways of circulating perhaps and use space outside here as well, just so that everyone's got an opportunity to get at the mic. Okay. But before we do that, let's thank our